That old car shouldn't even be allowed in this parking lot, my daughter-in-law said loud enough for everyone to hear, and the laughter that followed echoed across the polished concrete walls of the country club garage. I kept my hands on the steering wheel for a moment longer than necessary, listening to the engine of my 23-year-old Toyota Corolla tick softly as it cooled. The paint had faded from bright blue to something closer to gray, and the front bumper carried a thin crack that I had never bothered to fix. To Ashley, and to the group of well-dressed women standing beside her, the car probably looked like a relic that had wandered into the wrong decade. I opened the driver's door slowly and stepped out, smoothing the sleeve of my beige coat. The evening air carried the faint scent of polished leather and expensive perfume drifting down from the valet entrance above us. Ashley stood leaning against her husband's shiny black SUV, a champagne flute in her hand, surrounded by two of her friends from the club. Their heels clicked sharply against the concrete floor as they shifted their weight, glancing between me and my car with barely concealed amusement. "Margaret," Ashley said with a thin smile, tilting her head toward the Corolla. "I didn't realize they still allowed cars like that in this lot." One of the women beside her laughed quietly. Another lifted her phone, as if she might take a photo before thinking better of it. I looked at my car for a moment, noticing the familiar scratch along the passenger door where a shopping cart had once rolled into it outside a grocery store in Ohio nearly 15 years earlier. I remembered the day clearly because my husband had been with me, insisting the mark gave the car character. That memory passed through my mind like a brief, warm breeze, gone almost as soon as it appeared. "It still runs just fine," I said calmly, closing the door with a soft click. My voice didn't rise or sharpen. It rarely did anymore. Ashley raised her eyebrows, as if the statement confirmed her worst expectations. "Well," she said, taking a sip from her glass, "most people arriving tonight use the valet entrance upstairs. It's a little more appropriate for an event like this." I followed her gaze toward the ramp that led to the upper level of the garage, where the bright lights of the country club entrance glowed against the evening sky. Guests in tailored suits and elegant dresses walked past the red carpet near the doors, handing keys to uniformed attendants who parked sleek luxury cars in neat rows. A faint hum of conversation drifted down to where we stood. Ashley's friends exchanged another quick look, their smiles tight with the kind of politeness that only barely hides judgment. I brushed an invisible speck of dust from my coat and picked up my small leather handbag from the passenger seat. "I'm sure it'll be fine," I said quietly. Ashley laughed again, a little louder this time. "Of course it will," she replied, glancing at the Corolla once more before turning toward the elevator that led to the ballroom above. "Just try not to park too close to the expensive cars." The three of them walked away together, their voices fading into the soft mechanical hum of the garage. For a few seconds the space grew quiet again, broken only by the distant sound of tires rolling across polished concrete. I stood beside my car, running my fingers briefly along the worn edge of the door frame. To most people in that garage, the Corolla was just an old car that didn't belong among polished chrome and brand new paint. But to me, it had carried more years of my life than any of them could imagine. I closed my eyes for a moment, took a slow breath, and then turned toward the elevator that would take me upstairs to the celebration waiting above. I pressed the elevator button and watched the small digital numbers above the doors slowly count down from 3 to 1. The garage was quiet now, the laughter from a few minutes earlier already fading into the background of the evening. When the door slid open, I stepped inside and stood alone beneath the soft yellow light. The elevator began its slow climb toward the ballroom level, and I could already hear the distant sound of music drifting down the hallway above. It was the kind of music that always filled these country club events, something smooth and cheerful meant to make the room feel elegant. When the doors opened again, the difference between the garage and the main floor felt almost theatrical. Warm lights glowed across polished marble floors, and the scent of roasted steak and fresh bread floated through the air from the dining hall. A long table stood near the entrance, where two young attendants were checking guest names against a printed list. Beyond them, the ballroom doors stood open, revealing a sea of soft gold lighting, white tablecloths, and people dressed in dark suits and evening gowns. I walked toward the check-in table at a steady pace, the sound of my low heels tapping lightly against the floor. One of the attendants looked up with a polite smile. She could not have been older than 25. "Good evening, ma'am. May I have your name, please?" she asked, holding a tablet in one hand. "Margaret Whitmore," I replied. She typed the name carefully and waited for a moment. The smile on her face slowly faded into a look of mild confusion. She checked the list again, scrolling once, then twice. The second attendant leaned closer to look at the screen. "I am sorry," she said gently, "but I do not see that name on the guest list." I felt the quiet pause that followed, the kind that makes people nearby glance over without pretending they're listening. A group of guests walked past behind me, their voices cheerful as they stepped into the ballroom. For a moment, I wondered whether Ashley had simply forgotten to include my name. It would not have been the first time she had forgotten something about me. "Perhaps it is under Daniel Whitmore," I said calmly. The attendant searched again. Her finger moved slowly across the screen as she scanned the list of reservations tied to my son's name. She nodded when she found it. "Yes, I see Mr. Whitmore's table reservation here," she said, "but the seating count is already full." The words hung in the air between us. Full. Inside the ballroom, someone laughed loudly, followed by the soft clink of glasses being raised in a toast. I could see the tops of decorated tables through the open doors, each one arranged with candles and folded linen napkins. Ashley's voice drifted across the room as she greeted someone near the center table. She sounded perfectly comfortable, perfectly at home. I folded my hands lightly over my purse and looked back at the attendants. "That is all right," I said quietly. "I will wait here for a moment." They both nodded, with polite uncertainty, unsure what else they were allowed to do. I stepped aside near a tall window overlooking the driveway outside. From there I could see the long line of cars arriving under the covered entrance, while valets moved quickly from one vehicle to the next. The same entrance Ashley had suggested was more appropriate earlier. I stood there for a few minutes, listening to the music and the low murmur of conversation drifting through the ballroom doors, feeling as though I were standing just outside a room where everyone else had already been invited in. I remained by the tall window for a few minutes, watching the quiet choreography outside the entrance as cars pulled up one after another. A black sedan rolled to a stop beneath the awning, its headlights reflecting across the polished driveway while a valet opened the door with practiced ease. The couple who stepped out laughed about something as they walked toward the ballroom doors, their voices blending into the soft music inside. From where I stood, the celebration felt close enough to touch and yet oddly distant, like a room separated by glass. I rested my hands gently on the strap of my handbag and allowed my eyes to follow the slow movement of the evening beyond the window. Moments like that always bring memories with them, whether you invite them or not. I remembered another night many years earlier, long before these marble floors had ever been installed, when this entire property was nothing more than a stretch of open land surrounded by tall oak trees. My husband Thomas used to bring me here on Sunday afternoons after church. Back then there had only been a narrow gravel road and a small wooden sign marking the boundary of what the developers hoped would someday become a private club. I could still picture Thomas standing beside our old pickup truck with a folded blueprint in his hands, explaining how the ballroom would sit facing the lake and how the long driveway would curve through the trees so guests would arrive beneath a canopy of branches. He had a way of describing things that made unfinished places feel alive before they were ever built. Those afternoons had been quiet and simple. We would sit on the tailgate of the truck sharing sandwiches while he talked about the future of the club and the community it might bring together. I had listened more than I spoke because I always enjoyed hearing the excitement in his voice. When the construction began the following year, Thomas spent nearly every day on site, walking the property with architects and contractors, measuring distances and discussing details that most people would never notice once the building was complete. Sometimes he would bring me along, so I could see the progress. I remember standing in the open frame of what would eventually become the ballroom, sunlight pouring through unfinished beams while he pointed to the spot where the large windows would overlook the driveway. "People will arrive through those doors one day," he had said with a smile, "and they will never know how empty this place once looked." I thought about that sentence now as the music inside drifted down the hallway toward where I stood. The ballroom beyond the doors was full tonight, exactly as Thomas had once imagined. Waiters moved gracefully between tables carrying trays of drinks, and the soft glow of chandeliers reflected across polished glassware. Guests leaned close together in conversation, their voices forming a low, comfortable hum that filled the room. Across the hall, I caught a glimpse of Ashley again as she greeted another couple near the center table, her posture confident and relaxed. For a moment, I wondered whether she even remembered that I was still standing outside the ballroom doors. Then again, perhaps that had been the intention all along. I shifted my gaze back to the driveway outside the window and watched another car arrive beneath the bright entrance lights. The valet stepped forward quickly, opening the door with the same polite smile he offered every guest. The evening continued moving forward with effortless rhythm, as though nothing unusual had happened at all, and I remained quietly beside the window listening to the music while the past and present drifted together in the soft glow of the country club lights. I remained near the window long enough that the attendants at the check-in table began glancing toward me with quiet curiosity. They were trying to be polite about it, but I could see the uncertainty in their eyes each time another guest arrived and walked past me into the ballroom. Inside, the music shifted to a softer melody, and the sound of silverware touching china plates carried faintly through. The open doors. Someone near the front of the room laughed loudly again, and a ripple of cheerful conversation followed. It was the sound of a celebration moving forward without hesitation. I turned slightly, so I could see the ballroom more clearly through the doorway. From that angle, I could make out the long central table where Ashley and Daniel were seated with several of their friends. Ashley leaned forward as she spoke, her hand resting lightly on the edge of the table, while the others listened. She looked comfortable there, surrounded by warm lights and expensive decorations, exactly the kind of setting she always preferred. Daniel sat beside her, nodding politely as one of the men across from him spoke about something that seemed to amuse the group. For a moment, I studied my son's face from across the room. He had Thomas's eyes, the same calm expression that once made people trust him easily. Yet something about the way he sat there tonight felt different. Perhaps it was simply the distance between us, or perhaps it was the quiet realization that he had not once looked toward the doorway to see whether I had arrived. The thought passed through my mind without bitterness, more like a small observation than a complaint. Life has a way of rearranging relationships so slowly that the changes feel almost invisible until a moment like this brings them into focus. I shifted my attention back to the driveway outside the window. The evening air beyond the glass carried the faint glow of streetlights and the steady movement of arriving guests. A silver convertible pulled up beneath the entrance canopy, while the valet hurried forward to greet the driver. The scene repeated itself with quiet efficiency. Doors opened, guests stepped out, and the cars disappeared toward the lower parking levels while laughter and conversation flowed toward the ballroom. Watching it all unfold reminded me of how easily people judge what they see in a single moment. A polished car, a tailored suit, the confident way someone walks through a doorway. Those details create quick impressions, the kind that require no explanation. Yet the truth behind them is almost always hidden somewhere beneath the surface. I glanced down briefly at the keys in my hand, the worn metal ring reflecting a small streak of light from the window. The Corolla downstairs had been part of my life for more than 2 decades. It had carried groceries, suitcases, grandchildren's toys, and countless quiet drives across town when I simply needed time to think. Thomas had insisted we keep it long after we could have replaced it with something newer. If something still works, he used to say, there is no reason to pretend it does not. That simple sentence had guided more of our life together than most people realized. I slipped the keys back into my handbag and looked once more toward the ballroom entrance. The attendants at the table were helping another couple find their place cards, their voices polite and practiced. The evening continued unfolding around me, elegant and orderly, as though every detail had already been carefully planned. For a brief moment, I wondered how much of that order had begun long before the first guest arrived tonight, back when the land outside had been nothing but open grass and a man with a blueprint standing beside a dusty truck imagining what the future might look like. The music inside the ballroom shifted again, this time to something slower, the kind of melody that filled the air without demanding attention. I continued standing beside the window, watching the quiet rhythm of arrivals outside, when I noticed a tall man in a dark security uniform walking across the entrance lobby. His pace slowed as he approached the check-in table, and for a moment he spoke quietly with the two attendants before his eyes drifted across the room. When his gaze reached the window where I stood, he paused. There was a brief moment of recognition in his expression, the kind that appears slowly, like a memory trying to find its place. He took a few steps toward me, his shoes making soft sounds against the marble floor. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said politely, stopping a few feet away. His voice carried the calm tone of someone used to speaking with guests in formal settings. "May I ask your name?" I turned slightly toward him and met his eyes. "Margaret Whitmore," I replied. The moment the name left my lips, the man straightened almost immediately. His expression changed from polite curiosity to clear recognition. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said a little more carefully now, as if confirming something important. "I thought it might be you." I studied his face for a moment before the memories settled into place. He was older than the last time I had seen him, but the familiarity of his voice remained. "Mr. Carter," I said gently. A small smile appeared on his face. "Yes, ma'am. I've been working security here for quite a long time now." For a second his eyes moved toward the ballroom doors, then back to me. "I did not realize you were arriving tonight." No one mentioned it. His words were simple, but the meaning behind them was not difficult to understand. I glanced briefly toward the check-in table where the attendants were pretending not to listen while carefully adjusting their papers. "It seems there was some confusion about the guest list," I said calmly. Mr. Carter frowned slightly, the kind of quiet frown that appears when someone realizes a mistake has been made. "That does not seem right," he said slowly. "You should not be standing out here." I did not answer right away. Instead, I looked back toward the ballroom where the celebration continued without interruption. Glasses were raised in another toast near the center table, and Ashley's voice rose clearly above the music for a brief moment before fading again into the background. Mr. Carter followed my gaze and seemed to understand the situation without needing further explanation. After a moment, he lifted the small radio clipped to his shoulder. His voice remained calm and professional as he spoke into it. "Front desk, this is Carter. Please open the private driveway gate." There was a short pause while the response crackled softly through the speaker. Mr. Carter nodded once as he listened. "Yes," he added quietly, "for Mrs. Whitmore." He lowered the radio and turned back toward me with the same respectful expression. "The private entrance will be ready in just a moment," he said. Outside the window, the long gate at the far end of the driveway began to move slowly open, its polished iron bars sliding apart beneath the bright entrance lights. For the first time that evening, the attendants at the check-in table stopped pretending not to watch. Even the valet outside turned his head briefly toward the sound of the gate unlocking. The evening continued as elegantly as before, yet something subtle had shifted in the quiet space between the ballroom and the window where I stood. Mr. Carter stepped slightly aside and gestured toward the long corridor that led back toward the private entrance of the property. The movement was subtle, yet the respect in it was unmistakable. I could hear the faint metallic hum of the iron gate outside completing its slow movement as it slid fully open along the stone wall of the driveway. The sound carried through the lobby like a quiet announcement. For a moment no one spoke. The two attendants at the check-in table exchanged a quick glance, their earlier uncertainty replaced by the careful stillness people adopt when they realize they may have misunderstood a situation. Mr. Carter adjusted the small radio on his shoulder and then looked back at me. "The driveway behind the west garden leads directly to the private entrance of the ballroom," he explained in the calm tone of someone describing a route he had walked hundreds of times. "It will be easier if we go that way." I nodded once, though I did not immediately move. My eyes drifted toward the ballroom again where the celebration continued beneath warm lights and soft music. Ashley was still seated at the central table, leaning slightly toward one of her friends while speaking. From across the room, she looked confident, perfectly comfortable in the center of the evening she had helped organize. Daniel sat beside her, listening quietly while someone across the table told a story that caused a small wave of laughter. Neither of them had noticed the quiet shift taking place near the entrance. I turned back toward the window where the driveway could be seen beyond the glass. Outside, the iron gate now stood open, revealing a narrow stone path that curved through a row of tall hedges toward the back terrace of the country club. Most guests never used that entrance. It had been designed years ago for board members and special events that required a more private arrival. The driveway lights cast a soft golden line along the path, illuminating the hedges and the small garden lamps placed at careful intervals along the stone. Mr. Carter noticed the direction of my gaze and smiled faintly. "It has been a long time since that gate was opened this early in the evening," he said. His voice carried a quiet note of respect that did not need explanation. I remembered the last time I had walked that path clearly. Thomas had been beside me then, guiding me through the garden before the official opening night of the club many years earlier. The building had still smelled faintly of fresh wood and new paint, and the chandeliers had just been installed above the ballroom floor. Thomas had insisted we enter through the private driveway that evening, so he could show me the view of the garden lights reflecting against the windows. "People will arrive here someday," he had said as we walked together along the stone path, "and they will think this place has always been here." I felt the same quiet memory pass through my thoughts now as the lights from the garden reflected softly against the window beside me. Mr. Carter waited patiently a few steps away, his posture straight, giving me the respectful silence that comes from understanding someone is remembering something important. Finally, I turned toward him. "Thank you, Mr. Carter," I said gently. He nodded once and motioned toward the hallway that led to the garden entrance. As we began walking down the corridor, the sound of the ballroom behind us grew slightly quieter, though the music continued drifting through the building like a distant echo of celebration. Ahead of us, the door to the private terrace opened slowly, revealing the soft glow of the garden lights and the quiet stone path waiting beyond the hedges. The evening air outside the terrace carried the quiet scent of trimmed hedges and fresh grass as the garden lights illuminated the narrow stone path ahead of us. Each lamp cast a soft circle of golden light along the walkway, guiding the way toward the side entrance of the ballroom. I stepped forward slowly, the familiar sound of my shoes against the stone reminding me how many years had passed since the last time I walked through this garden at night. Mr. Carter walked a respectful distance beside me, allowing the silence to settle naturally between us. The music from the ballroom drifted through the glass walls to our right, softer now, like a distant echo carried through the hedges. For a moment we simply followed the path, without speaking. As we approached the corner where the garden curved toward the building, Mr. Carter glanced toward the illuminated windows of the ballroom and then back at me. "Your husband used to walk this path almost every evening while the club was being built," he said quietly. His voice carried the calm certainty of someone recalling a memory that had never quite faded. I smiled faintly at the thought. "Thomas believed you could understand a place better if you walked it slowly," I replied. "He used to say that buildings should grow into the land instead of replacing it." Mr. Carter nodded. "I remember that," he said. He told the architects the same thing more than once. The stone path ended near a small terrace, where tall glass doors opened directly into the far side of the ballroom. From here the entire room could be seen clearly through the windows. Chandeliers reflected across the polished floor while guests continued talking and laughing around the round tables arranged across the hall. Waiters moved smoothly between them, carrying trays of drinks and plates of food. The celebration looked elegant and effortless from this quiet corner of the garden. Mr. Carter rested his hands behind his back as he looked toward the ballroom lights. "Not many people here tonight know how this place started," he said after a moment. "Most of them only see the finished building." His words were not bitter, only thoughtful. I followed his gaze toward the ballroom and watched as Ashley stood from her chair at the center table to greet another group of guests arriving from the main entrance. Her smile was bright and confident as she shook hands and welcomed them. To anyone watching, she looked like the natural host of the evening. Mr. Carter lowered his voice slightly. "Your husband insisted the club be built for the community," he continued. "He turned down several investors who wanted to make it private for a smaller group. I was there the day he said this place should belong to the people who lived around it." The memory brought a quiet warmth to my chest. Thomas had never been interested in appearances. He cared more about the purpose behind things than the way they looked from the outside. "He would be happy to see the ballroom full tonight," I said softly. Mr. Carter gave a small nod. He would, he agreed. Although I suspect he would also expect certain people to remember who helped build it. The garden lights reflected gently against the glass doors beside us. For a few seconds we both stood in silence, watching the celebration through the windows. Then Mr. Carter stepped forward and pulled open the terrace door, holding it wide with a respectful gesture. The music inside grew clearer immediately, along with the sound of conversation rising across the room. From this entrance, the central tables were only a short walk away. For the first time that evening, the ballroom lights fell directly across the path where I stood, as though the quiet garden behind me had finally given way to the bright room ahead. I stepped through the terrace doors and into the warm glow of the ballroom lights. The sound of conversation grew clearer immediately, layered with the soft rhythm of music drifting from the small band at the far end of the room. For a brief moment, no one noticed my arrival. Guests continued speaking around the tables while waiters carried silver trays between the chairs. The chandeliers above reflected across the polished floor like quiet constellations. I walked forward slowly, following the path between two rows of tables toward the center of the room. A few people near the back glanced toward the terrace entrance as they noticed movement behind them. Their expressions shifted from casual curiosity to mild surprise when they saw where I had entered from. The private terrace doors were not used by most guests, and the subtle change in the room's attention moved quietly from one table to the next like a ripple across still water. At the central table, Ashley was finishing a sentence when she noticed the change in the direction of several people's gazes. Her smile lingered for a moment before she turned her head slightly to see what had drawn their attention. The moment her eyes landed on me, the expression on her face paused in mid-motion. It was only a fraction of a second, but long enough to be noticed by the guests seated beside her. Daniel followed her gaze and looked toward the terrace entrance as well. I continued walking calmly across the floor, my pace unhurried. The path between the tables felt strangely familiar, as though I had walked it many times before, even though years had passed since the last time I stood inside this ballroom. A waiter stepping past me slowed slightly and gave a respectful nod before continuing toward another table. The quiet shift in the room had become noticeable now. Conversation softened, and several guests leaned subtly toward one another as they watched me approach the central table. Ashley rose slowly from her chair. Her posture remained elegant, but there was a hint of uncertainty in the way her hands adjusted the edge of the tablecloth. "Margaret," she said with a polite smile that appeared a moment later than usual. "I did not realize you had arrived." Her voice carried across the table with practiced warmth, yet the small pause before the words made the moment feel heavier than she intended. I stopped beside the table and looked at her calmly. Daniel stood beside her now, his expression caught somewhere between surprise and quiet confusion. For a few seconds, the only sound came from the music drifting through the room and the faint clink of glasses being placed on the table nearby. Behind me, I could hear the terrace doors close softly as Mr. Carter stepped inside the ballroom and took his position near the wall. Several guests at neighboring tables had begun whispering quietly, trying to understand why someone would enter through the private garden doors. Ashley glanced briefly toward the terrace entrance and then back at me, her polite smile tightening slightly as she noticed Mr. Carter standing nearby. The room remained elegant and composed, yet the attention of nearly every person within view had shifted toward the quiet space around our table. In that moment, the celebration continued exactly as before, yet the center of the evening had subtly moved to the place where I stood. I looked at Ashley quietly while the soft music continued drifting through the ballroom. For a moment, she held her polite smile in place, the way people do when they are trying to maintain control of a situation that has suddenly shifted. Daniel glanced between us, his confusion slowly settling into recognition as he realized how I had entered the room. Around the table, the guests sat slightly straighter, their conversations fading into silence as curiosity replaced the earlier laughter. I rested my hands gently on the back of an empty chair and studied my son's face for a moment. "I did arrive earlier," I said calmly. My voice carried just enough to reach the nearby tables without rising above the music. Daniel frowned slightly. "Mom, we thought you were coming through the main entrance," he said. His tone was careful, as though he was still trying to understand what had happened. Ashley's eyes moved briefly toward the terrace doors again, then back to me. There must have been some confusion with the guest list, she added smoothly. The attendants probably just needed to check the reservation again. The explanation hung in the air, neat and convenient. For a few seconds no one spoke. I glanced across the ballroom, and then back toward the table. Yes, I said gently. There was a moment of confusion. Behind me I could hear Mr. Carter shift his weight near the wall. His presence had not gone unnoticed. Several guests had begun whispering quietly to one another, trying to understand why the head of security would personally escort someone through the private terrace entrance. Daniel looked toward the terrace door again, and then back at me. How did you come in from that side? He asked. I smiled faintly, not because the question amused me, but because the answer felt simple. That path has been there since the beginning, I said. Your father used to walk it almost every evening when the club was being built. The table fell quiet again. Ashley's expression changed slightly as the meaning of my words settled in. Daniel leaned back in his chair, thinking for a moment before speaking again. I remember Dad talking about those days, he said slowly. He spent months working on this place. I nodded. He did. I looked around the ballroom once more, taking in the lights, the music, and the guests gathered at the tables. This building was once nothing more than open land and a blueprint spread across the hood of a truck, I said quietly. Your father believed the club would bring people together. The room had grown noticeably still around us now. Even the nearby tables had paused their conversations. Ashley lowered her glass carefully onto the tablecloth. For the first time that evening, she did not immediately respond. Daniel studied the floor for a moment before looking back up at me. Mom, he said softly, you should sit with us. I considered the chair beside him and then gently shook my head. I will not stay long, I replied. My gaze moved briefly toward the terrace doors where the garden lights could still be seen through the glass. I only wanted to see the place once more tonight. I straightened the back of the empty chair lightly and gave Daniel a small nod. Then I turned and began walking back across the ballroom floor. The quiet attention of the room followed me for several steps before conversation slowly began to return. As I reached the terrace doors, the music continued playing exactly as it had before, but the meaning of the evening had shifted in a way that no one in the room would easily forget.